In 1943, the skies above Europe were filled with thunder. Every morning before sunrise, engines roared across the airfields of England as hundreds of bombers lined up for another mission. These were B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, enormous machines of aluminum and noise, carrying crews that were barely more than boys. They were farmer sons from Iowa, machinists from Detroit, students who had left behind textbooks for flight jackets. Each man climbed into his seat with the same quiet ritual, a glance at a lucky charm, a folded photograph, a whispered hope that this flight would not be the last. The cold at altitude was brutal. Frost coated the metal interiors, and oxygen masks pressed against numb faces. Inside, 10 men shared one fate, a pilot and co-pilot steering through clouds of flak, a navigator tracing invisible lines over enemy territory, a bombardier lying prone in the glass nose, and gunners braced behind their machine guns, eyes scanning the endless blue for movement. Outside, the air shimmered with danger. German fighters, sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, climbed from their bases, cutting through sunlight like metallic arrows. They attacked in tight groups, diving head-on, circling from below, streaking across the bombers' paths in perfect coordination. From the ground came another enemy, black bursts of anti-aircraft fire, precise and unrelenting. The sound was like steel rain, fragments tearing through air and aluminum alike. Every explosion marked the sky with dark smoke and a question: which crew had just vanished? The bombers pressed on regardless, straight and level, because the bomb run demanded it. Only after releasing their loads could they turn for home, engines straining, wings scarred, cabins filled with the smell of oil and fear. When the survivors returned, the sight was always the same. Holes peppered the fuselages. Entire sections of skin were missing, replaced by ragged sheets of metal. Sometimes one engine still smoked faintly, sometimes a landing gear refused to lock. Yet these were the lucky planes, the ones that made it back. On the runway, ground crews counted them silently, checking names against the morning roster. The missing ones were recorded with simple numbers on a clipboard, and fresh replacements arrived to fill the empty bunks by nightfall. The statistics were grim. In October 1943 alone, during what airmen later called Black Week, nearly 1 in 8 bombers failed to return. Missions to Bremen, Munster, and Schweinfurt ended in chaos, as entire formations were shredded in the air. A single day's operation could cost hundreds of men and dozens of aircraft. It wasn't courage they lacked, it was protection. The bombers' designers had balanced firepower, range, and speed, but armor remained their weakest point. Every pound of metal added for defense meant less room for fuel or bombs. Too much weight, and the aircraft couldn't reach its target. Too little, and the crews never came home. Commanders faced an impossible equation. How much armor was enough to save lives without sacrificing the mission itself? They tried everything, reinforcing the fuselage, adding steel plates near the cockpit, experimenting with new alloys. Still, the losses continued. The problem seemed unsolvable, a cruel law of physics that punished every attempt at balance. Somewhere, someone had to find the answer. Far from the battlefields, across the ocean in Manhattan, a different kind of war was being fought, not with bullets, but with numbers. Hidden within Columbia University, a secret organization known as the Statistical Research Group worked tirelessly for the US military. Inside its rooms, equations filled the blackboards, and coffee cups crowded the desks of mathematicians who rarely saw daylight. They weren't soldiers, but their calculations could decide who lived or perished. Every figure, every formula, might hold the key to survival. Among them was a man few had heard of, quiet, soft-spoken, with an accent shaped by another continent. His name was Abraham Wald. He had come to America only a few years earlier, a refugee from Europe carrying little more than a suitcase and a mind trained to see patterns where others saw noise. While others studied where bombers were hit, Wald would soon realize that the real mystery lay in what could not be seen at all. That realization, a question so simple yet so transformative, would change the course of wartime aviation and, ultimately, how humans think about evidence itself. While the roar of engines echoed across Europe, in the quiet corridors of Columbia University, the sound was that of chalk scratching equations across slate boards. The Statistical Research Group, or SRG, operated in secrecy, their windows covered, their findings classified. Here, instead of flight suits, men and women wore wrinkled shirts and spectacles. Yet their work was just as vital as any sortie. The government sent them data, raw and relentless, tables of damage reports, fuel consumption charts, trajectory analyses. The mission was simple on paper: find patterns that could help save lives, but the complexity behind those numbers was staggering. Each project was handled like a puzzle that could never be solved the same way twice. Some researchers studied how to improve artillery accuracy, others how to optimize radar detection. But among all those tasks, one question seemed to hang in the air like a ghost: how to make the bombers survive. The military supplied diagrams covered in dots and crosses, maps of bullet holes taken from returning aircraft. Engineers pored over them, noting where the metal was most frequently pierced: the wings, the fuselage, the tail. It seemed obvious what needed to be done. Strengthen those areas. Add armor where the bullet holes were thickest. On paper, it was the most reasonable conclusion imaginable. After all, the evidence was right there. The data didn't lie, or so it seemed. But to Abraham Wald, something about that logic felt incomplete. He didn't dismiss the diagrams. He simply asked a question that others had overlooked. His mind worked like an instrument finely tuned to contradiction. Numbers were not just quantities. They were reflections of what existed and what didn't. To him, every dataset was a story, and every story had missing pages. Wald spent evenings studying those aircraft reports, tracing each mark with his pencil, his expression unreadable. He wasn't interested in what was visible. He was haunted by what was absent. The diagram showed only the bombers that had made it home. What about the others? The ones that never landed? Those planes carried their secrets into the sea or burned quietly in the fields of occupied Europe. The pattern that everyone was analyzing represented only the survivors, and the survivors, Wald realized, were the exception, not the rule. That simple shift in thinking changed everything. Instead of asking where were they hit, he asked where could they be hit and still make it back. The holes, he reasoned, marked the safe zones, the areas that could take damage without bringing the aircraft down. The unmarked sections, the engines, the cockpit, the fuel tanks, those were the fatal points. They didn't appear on the charts because when those areas were struck, the planes never returned to be counted. It was an idea so obvious in hindsight that it seemed impossible no one had thought of it before. Yet in the chaos of war, when decisions were made by urgency and intuition, seeing what wasn't there required a rare kind of patience. Wald didn't announce his finding dramatically. He wrote it down quietly in a report, supported it with numbers, and sent it through the proper channels. The memo made its way to the engineers who had been struggling with the armor dilemma for months. When they read his explanation, some of them laughed at first, not in mockery, but in disbelief at how blind they had been to their own assumption. Wald's insight became one of the clearest examples of a principle later known as survivorship bias, the tendency to draw conclusions only from what is visible, forgetting everything that's missing. But at that moment, it wasn't a psychological concept. It was a practical solution that could save hundreds of aircrews. His recommendation was straightforward: reinforce the areas of the plane that showed the fewest hits, not the most. Protect the engines, the cockpit, and the fuel systems. The data, when inverted, told a new truth. The military acted quickly. Factories adjusted their production lines, engineers recalibrated their armor layouts, and maintenance crews began fitting bombers with the new protection pattern. Within weeks, results began to appear in mission reports. More aircraft returned from long-range operations. The numbers didn't tell a dramatic story, but in the quiet language of statistics, survival rates began to climb. Back at Columbia, Wald and his colleagues didn't celebrate loudly. They simply continued their work, aware that every small insight could ripple outward into the real world. For Wald, it wasn't about glory or recognition. He was a mathematician, one who had seen enough of human conflict to understand that the smallest clarity in thought could outlast the noise of battle. He didn't see himself as a hero. But his idea, the simple notion that what we don't see can be as important as what we do, would become a lens through which generations would later interpret everything from economics to medicine. Long before Abraham Wald found himself decoding the hidden language of war data, his life had already been shaped by patterns invisible to most. He was born in 1902 in a small city in Transylvania, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a place where languages mixed like colors on a painter's palette. Hungarian, Romanian, German, Yiddish, each street corner spoke differently. Yet inside the Wald home, there was a single language that ruled above all: discipline. His parents were devoted to their faith and to education. The Sabbath was sacred, and no work of any kind was permitted during that time, even school. Because of this, Abraham couldn't attend public classes like other children. 6-day school weeks left no space for his family's traditions. So his parents made a choice that would quietly define his entire future: They would teach him themselves. What began as an act of religious devotion soon revealed a hidden advantage. Without the structure of formal schooling, Abraham's curiosity roamed freely. When he became fascinated with numbers, his father brought home old mathematics books. When he asked about the stars, they found him astronomy texts. The boy learned quickly, and soon, he was outpacing every curriculum they could find. Unlike most students, Wald never learned to memorize formulas just to pass exams. Instead, he learned to understand them, to see how one idea flowed into another. The lack of routine forced him to develop habits of thought most people never acquire: independent reasoning, creative problem solving, and, most importantly, an instinct to question assumptions. To him, a missing piece of information wasn't an obstacle, it was an invitation. By the time he entered university in Cluj, he was already far ahead of his peers. Professors quickly noticed his quiet brilliance. He didn't seek attention or debate for its own sake. He simply saw patterns others missed. His studies led him to geometry first, but what fascinated him most wasn't the shapes themselves. It was the logic behind them, the unseen connections that made the world consistent. After earning his degree, Wald moved to Vienna, then one of the intellectual capitals of Europe. There, he completed his doctorate under the mentorship of some of the most respected mathematicians of the era. He was only 28 when he finished his dissertation, a work that displayed both precision and originality. Had the world been fair, his academic career would have begun immediately. But the Vienna of the 1930s was changing fast, and not for the better. Opportunities for Jewish scholars were shrinking. Universities that once prized talent now turned away brilliant minds because of prejudice. Wald applied for positions repeatedly and was turned down again and again, not because his work lacked merit, but because of who he was. It was a quiet injustice, one of countless small exclusions that, together, reshaped an entire generation's future. Eventually, he found modest work as a tutor and later as a researcher in economics, applying his mathematical insights to real-world data for the first time. It wasn't glamorous, but it suited him. He didn't crave the spotlight, he wanted truth. He explored how mathematical logic could reveal order within chaos, how numbers could describe even the most unpredictable human systems. But history was closing in. When Austria was annexed into Germany in 1938, life changed overnight. For people like Wald, it was no longer safe to stay. In that single year, he left behind everything: his home, his colleagues, nearly his entire family, and fled to the United States. Many of those he loved would never escape the turmoil that followed. For Wald, the loss became a silent burden that he would carry into every problem he solved thereafter. Arriving in America, he had no wealth, no position, and little English. What he did have was a mind that refused to give up. Soon, Columbia University recognized his talent and offered him a research fellowship. There, amid the hum of typewriters and the smell of coffee that never seemed to cool, he found a new kind of purpose. When war broke out, the US government began assembling not only soldiers and sailors but thinkers, mathematicians, physicists, and engineers to fight with ideas instead of weapons. Wald joined the Statistical Research Group, where his wartime analysis would forever change how people understood data. He had come from a world that taught him the cost of blindness, of ignoring what cannot be seen. Perhaps that is why he alone, when faced with the bomber reports, realized that the absence of information was not silence, it was the loudest signal of all. When Wald's report reached the military command, it did not arrive with any fanfare. It was just another memo among thousands, typed neatly, concise, mathematical in tone. But for those who took the time to read it carefully, it was nothing short of revolutionary. The engineers at the Army Air Force's headquarters studied the diagrams he had annotated and slowly realized what he was suggesting. For months, they had been reinforcing the wrong parts of their aircraft. Until that moment, the assumption seemed so obvious that no one had dared question it. More holes meant more danger, or so everyone believed. Wald's logic inverted that belief entirely. The damage seen on returning planes didn't show weakness, it revealed resilience. If those areas could be struck and the planes still return home, they were already strong enough. The real vulnerabilities were in the parts that never showed damage on surviving aircraft, because when those parts were hit, no one came back to tell the story. It was a revelation that embarrassed some engineers and astonished others. But more importantly, it demanded immediate action. Wald's recommendation spread quickly through the design and maintenance divisions. The next series of modifications to the B-17 and B-24 incorporated his insights directly: extra armor around the engines, added protection near the cockpit, and reinforcement of the control systems. The changes were subtle, small shifts in weight, slightly adjusted balance, but their effects were immense. In the following months, reports began to show measurable improvements. Aircraft once considered too fragile to survive deep raids into enemy territory were now returning more frequently. Even when damaged, they could stay airborne longer, giving crews a chance to escape, to land, to live. The transformation was so quiet that few outside the military ever heard of it. The official records never mentioned Wald by name, and the crews flying those missions had no idea that a soft-spoken mathematician in New York had helped keep their planes in the air. Yet the results spoke louder than any publicity. Every saved bomber represented not just a machine but 10 men, 10 stories spared from ending abruptly over foreign soil. In the SRG offices, Wald treated this success as he did any other mathematical result, calmly, analytically, with no hint of self-congratulation. He was already thinking of the next problem, the next pattern hidden inside data. But his colleagues couldn't help noticing that something about him had changed. The quiet man from Transylvania, who rarely smiled, seemed to have found a rare kind of satisfaction, not joy, but purpose. For Wald, this was more than statistics. It was a validation of a deeper principle, that truth often hides in absence, in the unseen gaps that others overlook. His bomber analysis wasn't just about armor, it was about perception itself. The ability to see beyond what's visible was, to him, the essence of both mathematics and survival. And this ability, he soon realized, had far-reaching consequences. Once the military understood the logic behind his approach, they began applying similar reasoning to other wartime problems. How should convoys be organized to minimize losses from submarines? Where should radar stations be placed for optimal coverage? Which types of missions provided the best balance between risk and reward? Each of these questions depended not just on data, but on recognizing what data wasn't showing. Within a year, Wald had become one of the SRG's most valuable minds. His colleagues, including future Nobel laureates, admired his clarity of thought. He was methodical yet imaginative, humble yet decisive. Even under immense pressure, with every calculation potentially affecting lives, he never raised his voice, never lost his calm. Those who worked with him often describe his reasoning as almost musical. He would sit silently while others debated, and then, after long minutes of thought, speak softly, not to argue, but to reframe the entire problem. He had an uncanny ability to find simplicity inside complexity, like discovering a melody hidden within noise. As his ideas spread through the military's analytical branches, they began to reshape how decisions were made. No longer did commanders rely solely on intuition or anecdotal experience. They started trusting statistical reasoning as a weapon of its own. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, one fought with equations, probabilities, and logic. And while few at the time realized it, this change marked the beginning of what would later become a revolution in decision science, economics, and even psychology. Wald's quiet discovery during the darkest years of the war would echo far beyond the battlefields, reaching into every field where people tried to understand the difference between what is seen and what is missing. As the war dragged on, the quiet offices of the Statistical Research Group at Columbia University became one of the most important battlefields in the world, a battlefield of numbers. Here, the sound of chalk scratching on blackboards replaced the roar of engines, and the smell of coffee replaced the scent of oil and smoke. Yet, the stakes were no less deadly. Every calculation, every formula scribbled in haste could mean the difference between life and loss thousands of miles away. Abraham Wald worked long hours, often deep into the night. His desk was always covered in sheets of paper filled with equations, geometric sketches, and lines of data that looked like chaos to anyone else. But to him, the patterns were alive. Each number told a story of survival, probability, and human ingenuity. His discovery about the bombers had changed the way the military thought about data, and now generals began sending him new problems almost daily. One day, it might be a question about how to position anti-aircraft guns to protect naval convoys. Another day, it could be how to design flight tests for new equipment without wasting scarce resources. Each question carried with it urgency, not theoretical curiosity, but a race against time. And Wald approached each challenge with the same calm precision that had already saved thousands of airmen. He believed that mathematics was not cold or detached. To him, it was a form of empathy, a way of seeing clearly in a world clouded by panic and guesswork. Numbers didn't lie, they simply needed to be interpreted correctly. If you could understand what they weren't showing you, then you could understand the truth. That philosophy began to ripple through every corner of the war effort. Officers who had once trusted only their instincts now began to consult statisticians before planning missions. Factory managers used data-driven methods to test the reliability of ammunition and engines. The concept of operational research, a term barely known before the war, became a discipline of its own. Wald's work had quietly sparked a revolution in military science. Still, he never sought attention. Many of his most significant reports were classified and remained unseen by the public for decades. But inside the SRG, everyone knew he was special. Milton Friedman, who would later become one of the most influential economists of the century, often said that Wald's mind worked on another level. While others argued about methods, Wald simply saw through problems as though they were transparent. The military's trust in statistics grew, and so did the complexity of its questions. Wald began developing new forms of analysis, what he called sequential testing. Instead of running endless experiments and waiting for a large batch of results, he found ways to stop early once the outcome became clear. This simple idea had enormous implications. It meant less wasted time, fewer resources consumed, and faster, safer decisions. The method would later revolutionize science, medicine, and industry, but at the time, it was simply another way to save lives in a war where every day mattered. Behind the walls of Columbia University, the researchers of the SRG began to feel the weight of what they were doing. They weren't designing weapons or commanding troops, but they were influencing the shape of battles. The air raids that followed Wald's recommendations showed fewer casualties. Mission planners used his methods to predict losses more accurately and plan around them. Even the aircraft factories began redesigning production lines based on his statistical models to minimize delays and defects. And through it all, Wald remained characteristically modest. He rarely spoke about himself, and when asked about his achievements, he redirected credit to the team or to mathematics itself. His colleagues noticed something else too, that he carried a quiet sadness beneath his calm exterior. While others celebrated Allied victories, Wald often looked distant. Those who knew his past understood why. The war that gave him purpose had also taken everything from him. He had escaped the growing darkness in Europe, but his family had not. Letters stopped coming long ago. Deep down, he knew what that silence meant, even if no telegram had ever confirmed it. Perhaps that loss was what drove him, the desire to make his work count, to ensure that suffering wasn't wasted. His way of thinking was shaped by personal tragedy and sharpened by mathematical clarity. He knew better than anyone that what you don't see can be just as important as what you do. The missing data in his own life, the absence of voices from home, echoed through his philosophy of analysis. By late 1944, the Allies had turned the tide of the war. The bombers that once returned in flaming ruin were now completing missions with far fewer losses. Military strategists marveled at how the shift had happened. To them, it seemed like technology had improved. But inside the SRG, the truth was known. It wasn't just new machines, but new thinking that had made the difference. Wald had given them a framework for reasoning under uncertainty, one that extended far beyond the battlefield. It wasn't about predicting the future perfectly. It was about understanding what the data concealed, about reading between the lines of probability. He had taught them that absence itself could be information. And that lesson would outlive the war. It would become a cornerstone of modern science, economics, and psychology. Wherever people use data to make decisions, whether testing medicines, managing risk, or analyzing markets, Wald's logic would be there, quietly guiding them to look not only at what exists, but at what's missing. In the end, his true weapon was not armor or machinery. It was clarity, the ability to see the unseen. And in the fog of war, clarity was the rarest and most valuable thing of all. When peace finally returned, the world emerged transformed. Cities lay in ruins, nations were rebuilding, and the airmen who survived the infernos of Europe went home, carrying invisible scars and stories few could comprehend. But among the countless engineers, scientists, and mathematicians who had helped end the war, one man's contribution was unlike any other. Abraham Wald had fought his battle not in the skies, but on paper, with logic sharper than steel and vision that pierced through illusion. As wartime secrecy began to fade, Wald's work slowly filtered into the broader academic world. Colleagues at Columbia University and beyond began to realize the scale of what he had done. He hadn't just solved a single military problem. He had laid the foundation for an entirely new way of reasoning about evidence. His method of questioning the unseen, of searching for the missing data, became known as survivorship analysis, and its implications stretched far beyond bomber armor. Students who crowded into his lectures describe him as soft-spoken, but mesmerizing. He rarely raised his voice, yet his words carried precision and purpose. He would begin by sketching a simple diagram, maybe a few dots on a board, or a curve describing probability, and within minutes, he'd build an entire universe of logic around it. To him, mathematics was not a tool, but a lens, a way to see through the fog that clouded human judgment. He warned his students about a subtle danger, the trap of only studying success. We learn from winners, he said, but success hides its own lessons. Look also at what has vanished. There lies the truth. His bomber analysis had shown this in a literal, life-and-death way, but Wald understood that the principle applied everywhere. From economics to biology to engineering, people constantly fell into the same trap. They studied what survived, not what was lost. His new research after the war expanded on this principle. He began developing sequential analysis, a mathematical framework that allowed experiments to adapt as they went. Instead of collecting all data first and analyzing it later, one could test, observe, and decide in real time. The implications were groundbreaking. With this method, scientists could stop an experiment early once the evidence became clear, saving resources, time, and sometimes lives. This concept would later reshape how clinical trials were conducted in medicine. Instead of forcing patients to continue taking ineffective treatments, doctors could end trials sooner and pivot to more promising options. In manufacturing, factories used Wald's methods to test product reliability more efficiently. Even in finance, his ideas helped investors identify when to stop risky ventures before losses became catastrophic. His thinking had escaped the boundaries of war and entered every realm where human decisions met uncertainty. But even as his reputation grew, Wald remained remarkably humble. He declined interviews and awards, preferring quiet evenings at his home in New York with his wife, Lucille. Those who visited described their apartment as simple but filled with warmth, stacks of papers, a few plants on the windowsill, and always the faint scent of tea. He lived modestly, never seeking the spotlight. To him, truth was its own reward. Still, the loss of his family lingered in every silence between his words. Friends noticed he often paused mid-sentence, as if thinking of something far away. The cheerful noise of post-war America, the parades, the optimism, the booming economy, felt distant to him. He had seen what blindness to reality could do. The lessons of his life, both mathematical and personal, revolved around one idea: never assume what you see is the whole story. In 1947, his masterpiece was published, Sequential Analysis. The book combined elegant theory with real-world practicality, turning what had once been wartime secrecy into a peacetime revolution. Scientists hailed it as one of the most important mathematical contributions of the century. Wald's approach allowed industries and governments to make faster, smarter, and safer decisions under uncertainty. By the end of the decade, his influence reached across the world. Universities invited him to speak, research institutes sought his advice, and students from dozens of countries came to study under him. One of those invitations came from India, a nation newly independent and eager to build its scientific foundations. The Indian Statistical Institute, led by visionary minds who admired Wald's work, invited him to lecture and help shape their statistical programs. It was a prestigious honor, one that symbolized how far his ideas had traveled. Wald accepted. It wasn't fame that drew him, it was curiosity. He wanted to see a country building knowledge from the ground up, applying mathematics to solve the challenges of a new age. In late 1950, he and his wife Lucille boarded a plane bound for India, leaving their 2 children in New York. It was meant to be a brief trip, just a few months of lectures and collaboration before returning home. No one knew it would be his final journey. As the plane crossed southern India, through the misty air of the Nilgiri Mountains, something went wrong. The aircraft disappeared from radar. Days later, search teams found the wreckage scattered along a steep hillside. All passengers and crew were lost. Abraham Wald was 48 years old. The news stunned the academic world. Obituaries appeared in journals across continents. At Columbia University, students and professors gathered in silence, reading the headlines with disbelief. A man who had survived the collapse of nations, who had escaped tyranny and remade the science of survival, was gone in a moment. Yet, even in that tragedy, his legacy endured. The work he left behind continued to grow in influence. His wartime reports were declassified, studied, and admired. Generations of researchers cited his insights as foundational to understanding uncertainty and bias. Every time a scientist questioned incomplete data, every time a decision-maker asked, "What are we not seeing?" Wald's spirit lived on. He had shown the world that true intelligence wasn't about seeing more than others, it was about seeing differently. While others stared at the data in front of them, Wald had the courage to ask about the data that wasn't there. And that single shift in perspective didn't just save lives during the war, it reshaped how humanity understands truth itself. Decades passed, but Wald's ideas refused to fade. What began as a wartime calculation had evolved into one of the most powerful mental frameworks of the modern world, the ability to recognize survivorship bias. His insight reshaped not just military strategy but the way scientists, economists, and ordinary people approach truth itself. In laboratories and boardrooms, in lecture halls and government offices, the same mistake Wald had once corrected kept reappearing, the human tendency to study only what survives. Historians studied the empires that lasted, not the dozens that vanished. Economists analyzed successful companies, ignoring the thousands that had failed using identical strategies. Doctors examined patients who recovered, forgetting those who didn't reach the hospital. Everywhere, the same blindness persisted, the blindness to the unseen. Wald's story became a kind of intellectual legend. Professors would tell it to new students as a parable of reasoning under pressure. They would describe how the US military once wanted to armor the bombers where they were most damaged, until one quiet mathematician asked the right question: where are the planes that didn't come back? That question, simple yet profound, changed everything. It revealed that wisdom lies not in counting bullet holes, but in recognizing where the holes are missing. As the decades rolled on, the term survivorship bias entered the vocabulary of every field that dealt with data. In business, it explained why reading only success stories leads to illusions, why studying billionaires' habits tells you nothing about the millions who followed the same path and failed. In medicine, it reminded researchers that hospital statistics represent survivors, not all patients. In finance, it exposed how investment firms inflated their track records by counting only the funds that remained open. Wald's insight became a cornerstone of critical thinking, a reminder that data is never neutral, and absence is often as informative as presence. Psychologists later studied why humans fall for survivorship bias so easily. Our minds are built to notice what's visible and forget what's gone. We see the winners, the famous, the successful, the enduring, and imagine they represent the whole story. The failures vanish quietly into history. It's comforting to believe success is proof of skill, and failure is proof of weakness. But Wald showed that the truth is more complex. Luck, circumstance, and invisible selection shape every outcome. The visible world is only half the picture. In the age of technology, Wald's lesson became more relevant than ever. Algorithms now analyze enormous amounts of data, but even machines can be fooled by survivorship bias. Artificial intelligence models trained only on successful examples produce skewed results. Business analysts who rely on incomplete datasets make confident but wrong predictions. Wald's insight became a warning not only for humans but for the machines they built. The danger of ignoring what's missing never goes away. At Columbia University, his legacy grew into a tradition. New generations of statisticians studied his methods, expanding them into Bayesian inference, decision theory, and experimental design. The corridors he once walked became the birthplace of new statistical revolutions. Professors would still point to his wartime photo, a thin, serious man in round glasses, eyes calm, almost detached, and remind their students that behind every great equation lies a story about human judgment, risk, and survival. Even the US military continued to honor his contribution. His approach to analyzing damaged aircraft became standard procedure in every major air force in the world. Engineers studying vehicle survivability, from tanks to helicopters to spacecraft, began using Wald-style models to infer weaknesses not from what survived but from what failed. When NASA investigated spacecraft safety, they used the same logic. Study not only the successful missions, but the lost ones, the Challenger, the Columbia, and learn from the data that no longer exists. In popular culture, Wald's name became synonymous with the kind of intelligence that defies intuition. His story appeared in documentaries, podcasts, and books on problem solving. Writers called him the man who saw the missing bullet holes, a mathematician who changed how people think without ever commanding an army or building a weapon. The image of bullet-riddled bombers returning from missions became a symbol, a metaphor for how we misunderstand success, mistaking survival for proof of strength when it may only be proof of luck. But perhaps the most powerful part of Wald's legacy isn't mathematical at all. It's philosophical. His life embodied the very principle he discovered. that what's missing can define everything. He lost his homeland, his family, and the world he grew up in, yet he built meaning out of absence. He transformed loss into clarity. In seeing what was missing from the data, he was, in a way, seeing himself, and turning pain into understanding that outlived him. Even now, more than 70 years later, the story of Abraham Wald continues to be told not just as history, but as guidance. Every generation that faces uncertainty, scientists trying to cure diseases, investors navigating crises, engineers designing safer machines, can trace part of their thinking back to that one moment in 1943 when a mathematician looked at bullet holes and saw what everyone else missed. His question still echoes in every field where data is king. What am I not seeing? That question has no final answer, and that's what makes it timeless. In today's world, where data flows faster than ever before, Abraham Wald's lesson has only become more vital. Modern life runs on statistics. Every decision, every forecast, every algorithm relies on data. But data, no matter how vast, is still shaped by what's missing. Wald's insight, that what we don't see can be more important than what we do, remains a quiet but powerful warning beneath the noise of modern certainty. Consider aviation today, the field where Wald first made his mark. Engineers no longer study bullet holes on bombers, but the logic he introduced still guides their work. When investigators analyze aircraft accidents, they don't just examine the planes that landed safely, they study the ones that didn't. The lessons that prevent future disasters are hidden in wreckage, in the black boxes, in what failed. Wald's approach became the foundation for every modern safety system. Whether designing a jetliner, a spacecraft, or even self-driving vehicles, engineers now start by asking, where are the failures we don't see? That mindset saves lives every day. When an airliner narrowly avoids an accident, aviation authorities don't celebrate luck, they analyze it, looking for invisible weaknesses. It's the same logic Wald used in 1943. You learn not from the aircraft that survived, but from the ones that didn't. That shift, from comfort in success to obsession with absence, is what defines true safety. The same principle extends to medicine. Modern epidemiology, the science of studying diseases, depends on identifying missing data. When a new treatment appears effective, researchers now ask, who didn't make it into our study? Who dropped out, and why? Without that awareness, medical breakthroughs can mislead entire generations of doctors. During the early years of cardiac research, scientists once believed that men were more prone to heart problems because almost all patients in hospitals were male. It took decades before someone noticed the survivorship bias. Women were dying before they even reached the hospital, excluded from the data that shaped medicine. Once again, Wald's invisible logic re-emerged. The missing cases were the key to truth. Even in business, his thinking continues to separate insight from illusion. Corporate success stories flood the media. The startups that turned into billion-dollar empires, the investors who saw the future, the leaders who claimed to know the formula for greatness. But for every company that thrived, hundreds vanished quietly. Wald's reasoning tells us to ask, what did those failures have in common? What were their hidden constraints, their unseen risks? Without that perspective, the stories we tell about success become fairy tales, comforting, but dangerously incomplete. In finance, analysts now design models that explicitly correct for survivorship bias. When tracking stock market performance, they include the companies that disappeared, those that went bankrupt, merged, or closed. Ignoring them gives an illusion of stability. Including them tells the truth. Investors who forget that principle fall into the same trap as the engineers who armored the wrong parts of their bombers, protecting what's visible while leaving the real vulnerabilities exposed. Even artificial intelligence, the latest frontier of human progress, must heed Wald's warning. Machine learning systems learn from data, but if that data includes only successes, the machines inherit our biases. An AI trained on loan applications from people who were approved will assume everyone looks like a good borrower. One trained on medical images only from survivors will misjudge severity in critical cases. Wald's insight is now coded into algorithms themselves. Data scientists create bias correction models that mimic his logic, searching for the patterns missing from their datasets. In a sense, modern AI owes part of its conscience to a man who wrote equations by hand on wartime paper. There's also a more personal side to Wald's message, one that reaches beyond science. In everyday life, people constantly compare themselves to survivors. We admire those who made it, the actors, athletes, entrepreneurs, and assume their habits. Confidence, or willpower explain success. But Wald reminds us that for every visible victor, there are countless others who followed the same path and vanished into obscurity. Talent, effort, and strategy matter, but luck and circumstance shape the rest. His insight humbles ambition. It teaches perspective. In classrooms around the world, teachers use the story of the missing bullet holes to teach not just statistics, but wisdom. It's a lesson about humility, about questioning certainty, especially when everything seems obvious. Students are told that the data in front of them isn't the full story, that sometimes the truth hides in silence, in the absence of evidence. It's a story that transcends mathematics, because at its core, it's about awareness, the awareness to see beyond the surface. And that awareness, as Wald proved, can save lives. It can prevent errors that ripple through entire systems. It can correct biases that mislead nations, industries, and individuals. The power of his discovery lies not just in mathematics, but in the mindset it represents, the refusal to be fooled by visibility. He showed that intelligence isn't about knowing more facts, but about knowing what's missing. To see the invisible, that is the highest form of understanding. Long after the war, long after the bombers had fallen silent, Abraham Wald's insight began to take on a meaning far beyond numbers. What had started as a statistical correction grew into a philosophy of perception, a way to understand how humans, even with all their intelligence, so often misread the world around them. His question, "What am I not seeing?" became not only a mathematical principle but a metaphor for truth itself. Every generation believes it sees clearly. We trust what's in front of us, the evidence, the stories, the patterns that seem to make sense. But Wald's life reminds us that what we see is filtered, by chance, by survival, by history itself. Our minds are drawn to what remains, to what endures. We build our understanding from fragments of a larger picture, unaware that much of it has vanished. In every dataset, every history book, every memory, there are invisible gaps. Wald's genius was not in closing those gaps but in learning to recognize that they exist. He taught that the human tendency to see patterns in survival can be both comforting and dangerous. We celebrate the victorious and assume their path must be the right one. We forget that countless others walked the same road and simply disappeared from a story. Survivorship bias, in this sense, is not just a statistical flaw, it's a human one. It's the story of how we mistake endurance for wisdom and visibility for truth. This bias colors everything. It shapes how we define success, how we teach history, even how we measure progress. The companies that endure become case studies, while the thousands that failed vanish without trace. The leaders who succeed are called visionaries, while those who stumbled are forgotten, even if their choices were identical. The same illusion drives cultural memory. The songs that survive become timeless classics, while the millions of unheard melodies fade into silence. The survivors shape our sense of what's possible, but they tell only half the story. Wald's perspective offers a quiet, almost moral clarity in this chaos. To think like him is to resist easy conclusions. It is to pause before declaring what something means and ask instead what's missing from the picture. It is to recognize that truth often hides in silence, in what's unmeasured, unrecorded, unspoken. He showed that objectivity isn't about collecting more data, but about asking deeper questions about the data we already have. His own life mirrored that insight. Wald knew what it meant to live in the shadow of absence. He had escaped one of history's darkest chapters, but the cost was unbearable. A family lost, a homeland erased. That loss, though unspeakable, sharpened his vision. He understood that every dataset, like every life, is incomplete. You cannot rebuild what's gone, but you can honor it by refusing to forget it, by building awareness around its absence. In his mathematics, that awareness became a method. In his life, it became meaning. And perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply. It reminds us that intelligence and empathy are not opposites. True understanding, whether in science or in life, comes from humility, from knowing that we never have the full picture. The greatest danger, Wald might say, isn't ignorance, but overconfidence, believing we see all when we see only what's left behind. In an era where information floods every screen, his insight is more necessary than ever. We scroll through curated feeds and call it truth. We see the successful few and assume their path is replicable. We look at the survivors of history, the nations, the heroes, the ideas that endured, and forget the countless possibilities that were lost before they could be recorded. Wald's question still echoes through this modern fog. What am I not seeing? What has disappeared that might change everything I think I know? To live by that question is to think clearly. It means being skeptical not of facts, but of completeness. It means understanding that knowledge without awareness of its limits becomes illusion. It means seeing the invisible patterns, not through mysticism, but through logic, humility, and compassion. Wald's mind lived in the space between what could be measured and what could not. And in that space, he found not despair, but clarity, the understanding that absence, too, has meaning. Abraham Wald never lived to see how far his question would travel. Yet, his quiet way of thinking has outlived the machines of war, the empires that built them, and even the century that gave him life. Today, his logic is woven into the DNA of science, technology, and philosophy. Every field that seeks truth through evidence, from medicine to artificial intelligence, stands on the foundation he built when he looked at bullet holes and dared to ask what everyone else ignored. In modern research, Wald's influence appears under many names: bias correction, incomplete data modeling, missing variable inference, but the heart of it remains unchanged. His insight protects doctors from false confidence when testing new drugs. It helps engineers design safer vehicles by studying not only the ones that survived collisions but those that didn't. It guides economists who know that markets reveal only the winners, not the countless attempts that quietly collapsed. Every time someone adjusts a model to account for what isn't visible, they are unknowingly echoing Wald's voice. But beyond the technical, there's something deeply human about his legacy. Wald's method is not just a statistical tool, it's a philosophy of empathy. To ask what's missing is also to care about what's been forgotten. It's an act of intellectual compassion, a refusal to ignore the unseen, the unheard, the unrecorded. In a world obsessed with visibility, he taught us to look for the invisible. That mindset can transform more than science. It can change how we understand people. When we see someone succeed, Wald's wisdom reminds us not to envy them blindly, but to recognize the invisible factors behind their story: the luck, the timing, the help, the failures hidden from view. When we meet someone struggling, it tells us not to judge them by their outcomes, but to imagine the unseen battles shaping their path. His question, "What am I not seeing?" can turn data into wisdom and observation into understanding. If you trace this principle far enough, it reaches every corner of human life. History itself is shaped by survivorship bias. We know the civilizations that endured: Rome, China, Egypt, but for every empire that built monuments, there were dozens that left no trace. We inherit the voices that survived, not the ones that were silenced. Even art, philosophy, and culture are subject to this invisible filter. The stories we read, the heroes we celebrate, the ideas we call timeless, all are survivors of chance, preserved by circumstance as much as by merit. Wald's thinking invites us to approach the world with curiosity rather than certainty, to look at a statistic, a story, or even a belief and ask, what's missing from this picture? What voices, what data, what experiences have been left out? It's a simple habit, yet one that separates critical thinkers from followers. It's the essence of wisdom, the ability to question not the truth itself, but the completeness of it. And that idea, the humility to doubt what seems clear, may be his greatest gift. Because in an age where certainty spreads faster than accuracy, where confidence often drowns out understanding, Wald's quiet logic is a lifeline. It reminds us that truth is rarely found in what's loudest, brightest, or most visible. It lives in the silence between the numbers, in the missing pieces of the puzzle, in the questions we forget to ask. Today, students around the world still study his work, often without knowing his full story. They learn the equations, the models, the proofs. But the deeper lesson, the one that saved lives and reshaped thought, lies between the lines. It's not about mathematics at all. It's about perception. About the discipline to look again when everyone else has already decided. Wald's story ends on a mountainside in India, but his question has no ending. It travels quietly through every mind that seeks to see the world as it truly is, incomplete, uncertain, but full of meaning if you learn to look deeper. His life was a testament to the power of thought guided by compassion, of reason sharpened by humility. Some people change the world by shouting. Wald did it by noticing what was missing. And so, his legacy endures, not in monuments or medals, but in every moment someone, somewhere, pauses before reaching a conclusion and asks the same timeless question. What am I not seeing?